You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 255. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Do you ever find yourself feeling like your practice runs you and not the other way around? These were words that were spoken to me by a lawyer in private practice many years ago, and they are words that have stuck with me because I have heard them or some version of them for years. And I know that I struggled with time when I was a lawyer in private practice. I still do. And I know that a number of you are also struggling with time. And it is one of those areas where I truly love helping my clients, helping lawyers just like you to figure out ways to maximize your time, to not waste time, to manage the fluctuations in your work so that you feel more in control, so that you feel more calm throughout the day. Now, if you are a lawyer in private practice, my guess is that you live somewhere on a spectrum on any given day, where at one end of the spectrum, there is chaos, right? There is chaos of the uncertainties and unpredictabilities of private practice, right? You do not know when work is going to come through the door. Some of it will be predictable, right? There are cycles, business cycles. There are times of the year where there may be deadlines, tax filings, for example, or year-end closings. You may have a trial coming up, and so you can anticipate that it's going to get really busy at certain periods in preparation for and attendance at that trial. There may be new laws that are coming into place, and your clients need to all comply by a certain deadline, or people want to get things done before those new laws come into place. So on the one hand, there's this feeling or this reality that there is chaos at one end of the spectrum where everything feels out of control, unpredictable. It's coming at you all at once. You've got multiple work sources and expectations to do everything, not now, but right now. Better actually to have done it yesterday. So that is what chaos looks like. And on the other hand of that spectrum, right, at the other end of the scale, there's this notion of control. And we all kind of look to that end, right? Control being where your days are predictable, where you have a calendar and you get to follow your calendar, where you know what deadlines are coming up, where you are meeting your deadlines consistently, where you sit down to work and you actually follow through on the work instead of procrastinating or getting distracted or deciding that you really don't have the motivation to do it at that time. And so what is realistic, what I have noticed in a practice, a legal practice, and to be honest, other professional areas. As a coach, I see not just lawyers, but other entrepreneurs and coaches and professionals who are out there trying to achieve this balance, right? This work-life balance, trying to manage their time better, trying to have structured weeks, trying to get things done. And the reality is, if you've got chaos at one end of the spectrum, you've got complete control at the other end of the spectrum. Nobody is really living it one extreme or the other. There is some place, maybe in the middle, maybe closer to one end or the other, where you're likely to find yourself on a relatively frequent basis. So the reason that I want to talk about this today, the reason that we're talking about chaos, control, time management, lawyers in private practice, is that this is very at the heart of a question that comes to me in different forms, in different language from lawyers at all different levels, which is essentially something like this. Why does it feel so chaotic? How can I have more control over my time? Can I have more control over my time? Will it always look like this? Can I do this? How long can I do this? And so it almost boils down to this idea of, can I make this work? What can I do to make this work? How can I make this work? And so today's episode really is a heart-to-heart conversation with you about helping you figure out where you do have control, because you do have control and maybe more control than you think you do. And there's also going to be elements that are outside of your control. And what I would love to take you through is an exercise, a discussion, where I'm going to share with you 4 areas, 4 levers, 4 factors that you can consider when it comes to you in your practice. And I'm making the assumption that you're in private practice. And so that's how I'm going to really tailor this conversation. It's probably still relevant even if you're not in private practice. But really, that's who I'm thinking about. And what are the levers that you can pull on? What are the factors that you need to consider in order to make a determination? Is private practice for you? How do you control your time better? How do you deal with the ebbs and flows? Is this sustainable for you? And I would love for you to have greater clarity at the end of today's conversation. I would love for you to walk away with a feeling of empowerment that you now know what you can do to improve your time management, to feel more at the control end of the spectrum versus the chaos end of the spectrum, especially if you're feeling a lot of chaos right now. And for you to have a plan going forward, how long you want to do this, where you want to do this, what private practice ideally would look like for you, and how you can create for yourself structures and systems and processes and philosophies that will support you as you move forward throughout your career. So hopefully this has given you a bit of a snapshot, a window into what we're going to talk about today. And wherever it is that you find yourself right now, and maybe you self-assess, right? If you were to put yourself on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is total chaos and 10 is total control, where are you right now? Maybe you're at a 7. Great. You're doing pretty well. And maybe there's some tweaks here that we can expose you to that might help you. Or maybe you're at a 2, in which case I'm really glad that you're here, that you're helping yourself, that you're taking positive steps by listening to this podcast and figuring out some of the ways that you might be able to gain more control over your practice and feel more confident, feel more calm, feel more in control of things as you move forward. So let's start out with factor number 1, which is if you are in private practice, I'm going to make the assumption that you're working at a law firm. And if there's one thing I've learned through my coaching experience, it is that law firms are so different from each other. As a practitioner, you will work in a certain number of firms. My guess is it's relatively limited. I'm going to throw out less than 10 as an estimate of how many law firms most people will find themselves working in. And so you're not necessarily seeing the breadth of how different lawyers practice within the context of a law firm. So if I'm trying to explain what that would look like is, on the one end, you may have a solo practice and that's going to look a certain way. And each solo practice is going to look different depending on the lawyer who's running that practice and what they're choosing for themselves in terms of lifestyle and workflow and volume. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got large firms, national, international firms, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of lawyers where there's a lot of structure. There may be high volume. There may be billable targets that are, they range, right? Even within large firms, there's a huge range in terms of the billing targets, the expectations. And so what I'm inviting you to consider here is that the context in which you practice is very unique to you, is unique to your firm. And so the first question that I would encourage you to ask yourself, if you're in a position where you're feeling like there's a lot of chaos, like it's out of control, you're not able to keep up with your workload, the work is coming in from all different sources, you're having trouble keeping up, you're having trouble keeping track, you're not meeting deadlines, you're having trouble communicating, whatever that looks like, is that there are so many different variations of what your practice could look like. And the question for you to decide on is, are you in the right place? If you are in private practice, are you in a firm that aligns with what it is that you are wanting in your career? And this might look different depending on the stage of practice that you're at, right? I've worked with lawyers who, at the very beginning of their careers, want to have a very intense experience of their work. They want to work around the clock. They're happy to work around the clock. And by around the clock, that depends, right? That will look different for different people. Your definition of around the clock, of course, is it 150 hours a month? Is it 300 hours a month? That will depend on you. And the question is, what do you desire at each stage of your practice? And I mentioned some lawyers at the very beginning are very much minded toward what might be might be considered a very intense work schedule. And others at the very beginning of their practice have already decided that's not what I want. I actually want something that's a lot more balanced in their view, where there's a certain number of hours that permits them to have a more sort of expansive experience of what their life is like outside of the office. So that's at the beginning stage. And as you progress through your career, you'll probably also have a different appetite for work at different stages. And so much of this is contextual. What stage are you at? It's also personal. Some lawyers really do want to practice law 7 days a week. That's how they are wired. That's what they want. And if that is, you may not even be listening to this podcast, or maybe you are and you're thinking, well, how can I tweak this so that I can extract even more out of my time? How can I really amplify? In which case, I mean, there's no right or wrong here, but the first question to answer, if you are struggling in your practice and asking yourself, why is it like this? Does it always have to be like this? Is to ask yourself if you're in the right place. And that is a deep reflection question of both the environment that you're in, so the firm and the expectations and the culture and the hours and what they are doing, right? How do they bring in work? How do they allocate work? How does the firm manage workflow? So there's the structure that you're in, and there's you. What is it that is comfortable for you or desirable for you? They may not be the same thing. What is your vision for your practice at this stage and at the stages to come? And so you want to be intentional about the appetite that you have for work and also where you choose to do that work. So the first factor to consider, right? If you're in that zone of struggle, right? You're somewhere between chaos and control. You're feeling a bit closer to chaos and you're wondering, how long do I keep this up? How long is this sustainable? We want to make sure that you're in the right place at the right time. And if you're not in the right place, that may require a move. If you are in the right place, you're actually very happy where you are. You know this is where you want to be. You're in a firm that you feel like aligns with your interests, what you want to do. You love the culture, you love the work, and you're simply struggling because you're finding, it's hard to manage the volume and the workflow, etc. Then you've made that decision. And so that brings you to the next question, which is, how do you make it work? In the container that you're in, how do you make it work? So that brings us to factor number 2. And I will always come back to the fundamentals whenever a lawyer reaches out to me and they have some issue with time management. And that issue will sometimes present as a big question, right? Like, I know I need more systems. I really want to have a better planning structure. I know that I'm missing opportunities in my day and I want to work better. I procrastinate and I need to know how to figure out how to deal with procrastination in the moment. I don't feel motivated. How do I overcome that lack of motivation? So it comes up in different ways, right? Lawyers who have just stepped out of a trial, for example, and they find there's a lack of motivation. How do you get started up again when maybe you're exhausted and it feels really hard to work on anything that isn't terribly urgent? Or maybe you've got so much volume and you're trying to figure out how to deal with that volume. Or maybe you're at a firm and people are starting to develop a bit of a difficult relationship with you, right? Maybe you've missed a deadline or two, or maybe they don't fully trust that you're going to deliver something on time. Maybe you don't trust yourself to deliver something on time. So there's lots of scenarios where time can be an issue. You might feel like you're not getting enough time away from the office, that you lack rest. So how do you incorporate more rest into your life? Or you are a new parent and you're trying to figure out how to juggle the schedule now that you've got daycare pickups and you've got additional meal prep and things to do at home, and you want to spend time with your child before they go to sleep at night. So there's all these different factors that will be considered at different stages of your life. And the thing that always comes down to, or that it always comes down to, is having a system in place where you are structuring your time. Now, the objection that I will often hear is I don't want to plan or structure my time because I know that the minute that I step into the office, there's going to be a surprise that comes at me. There's going to be an emergency file. Someone's going to call me. I'm going to get interrupted. And so what is the point in planning out my day, planning out my week, if I know that I'm not going to be able to stick to my schedule? And I get it. I totally get it. I empathize. And what I would say to you, if this sounds like something that you might say or that you might feel, is that we want to do it anyways, because the difference is really, going back to that spectrum, if you've got chaos at one end and you've got control at the other, and we are somewhere in the middle, if there's no plan, right, and you're being 100% reactive, it's really easy to lose track of things. It's really easy to lose track of deadlines. And that system is going to feel really uncomfortable. It's going to feel really chaotic. And lawyers sometimes find themselves there, not because they are bad people or irresponsible people or people that we should judge, but often it's because the skill set that they relied on to get to where they are didn't require a lot of planning. It didn't require that things be coordinated among multiple people. And if you think of what that could look like, right? Sometimes that's a lawyer who goes through law school and maybe they never need to write things down because they've got a really excellent working memory. And so everything gets committed to their memory. They never forget a date. They always know what's going on. And that works until it doesn't, right? Until they reach a point where they've got multiple projects on the go. They've got clients, internal and external, that they're reporting to. They've got multiple deadlines that they need to keep track of. They've delegated work and they're trying to remember who they delegated the work to, when those things are coming in. And so the amount of information they are trying to hold in their memory has become explosive relative to what they were trying to hold on to before. And it involves multiple people. And so the system, the strategy, having a really strong working memory is no longer effective, which means that we now need to find a new way to manage time that is more compatible with the current reality. So the first thing that I always recommend, especially for lawyers who are used to dealing with a very strong working memory, who are used to not writing things down, is to create some way of planning so that you're externalizing, you're taking the pressure off of your working memory, and you're able to look at your to-do list, you're able to look at your client list, you're able to see what needs to be done on files, right? And you're able to then plan strategically. So if you are currently one of those people who is feeling like your practice is very reactive, my first question to you would be, how are you planning? And my guess is you've got some things you're already doing. And what I would take you through, what I would want to see for you, is a more consistent and routine approach to planning. So again, going back to that big question, okay, my practice feels chaotic. How do I get more control over my practice? Well, the answer is we develop a process for you to plan your time strategically. And when I work with lawyers, I usually go through a number of different processes. It starts with planning, right? Looking at your inputs. Where's your work coming from? How do you keep track of your files? Do you have a file list? Is that file list something that you share with others, like your assistant, maybe somebody else on your team? We look at scheduling, right? How do you take the items that are on your plan and then put them into your calendar? How do you calendar? Do you have the ability to theme your days? How do you break up your time in a day? What does your energy look like throughout the course of the day? And when are you assigning tasks? Are they compatible with your energy levels? So for example, if you're at the best, right, your best brain is first thing in the morning, we want to make sure that you've got your most challenging tasks first thing in the morning. We don't want to leave them to the afternoon where maybe you're really tired and it's harder to focus. It will take you longer to do that complex drafting at 4 p.m. when you're spent than it will at 9 a.m. when you're relatively fresh. We also want to look at patterns and things that are happening throughout the course of the day. Are you taking a lunch break? And if so, can we create some time blocks around that? Use your lunch break as an anchor to start creating pockets of time so that you can use those pockets to create windows of productivity. How can you use your calendar to increase your productivity? We want to look at priorities, right? Are you planning and executing based on what's most important, or are you executing based on what showed up most recently on your desk? And so when it comes to planning, and again, we're trying to figure out where you have leverage over your practice. And in the realm of time management, we want to develop systems for you that you control. You control the planning, the scheduling, you know what your energy levels are, you know what the cadence of your day is, you know what your practice looks like. And so how can we take all of those different inputs, right? What's happening externally and how you are wired personally, what your strengths are, right? Planning, organization, time management, you're going to have certain strengths. You're also going to have areas where you're not as strong. How do we develop a system so that you are leveraging your strengths, you're compensating for areas where you're not as strong, and you're doing so in a way that is realistic within your practice? So if you're feeling like, oh, like I just don't know where to start, you're welcome to reach out to me. You're welcome to listen to episodes in this podcast. I have an entire podcast roadmap that outlines the steps, all of the different categories of time management. So please consult that. Please reach out to me. But the idea here is to create some structure around your time, because only then will you know, right? If you haven't got these structures in place, or if you've got structures in place, but you know that you can improve them, only when you start to do that work will you start to see whether or not you could create sustainability by increasing the amount of structure, planning, and processes that you yourself integrate into your practice. So again, kind of going back big picture, we started with, are you in the right container, right? Have you put yourself in a private practice environment that aligns with who you are and what you want for your professional work? Number 2 is, are you planning strategically? Are you managing your time strategically in a way where you're taking the different levers, you're creating systems, and you're doing your best? And again, we haven't really talked about the things that are outside of your control, but there are those things outside of your control. But what is in your control, and are we leveraging all those things? So that brings us to point number 3. And point number 3 is really designed to address that concern that everybody has and that everybody is going to struggle with, which is the idea that you can lay the best of plans, right? We can absolutely do that based on what would be most efficient, based on what would be most desirable in terms of outcomes. And the reality is, and I've seen this in all areas, basically any profession, any person that is doing any type of work that is not literally you show up at a workplace at 8 and you have a shift that lasts so many hours with a 15-minute break in the beginning and a 15-minute break at the end, and somewhere in the middle there's an hour for lunch. I mean, those jobs do exist. I used to work as a barista at Starbucks. That's how my day was structured. I mean, this is many years ago. I mean, back in the 90s, but that's how your day was structured, right? You didn't have to work overtime unless maybe somebody didn't show up for their shift. But a shift work is literally you are there when you're there and you're not when you're not. And I don't think there's too many professional services roles. I mean, maybe if you're working in a highly structured environment where maybe it's really expected that you show up between hours X and Y and you take your breaks, and that's how it is. But with law in particular, I think it's really hard to be able to contain your work into discrete pockets of time. It's like studying for an exam, right? There's no end to how much you could study. Or if you're drafting materials for court, right? Sometimes you come across a case that throws off your entire argument, and now you've got to go back to the beginning, or you've got to rethink your argument. Or you're meeting with a client, they're expected to come into the office at 10 a.m. They get stuck on something at the office, or they get caught up in traffic. And so that meeting gets pushed to 10. And so the end of that meeting was supposed to be at 11 a.m. and now that meeting is going to 12. Or maybe during that meeting, something else happened. And so now that meeting is no longer 1 hour, it's 3 hours. So the reality is life is unpredictable, right? If you've got kids at home, one of them is sick and you need to stay at home instead of going into the office as you had planned. So there's going to be unpredictability built into your life. And so as much as I would love to say that you can control your time, that you could be at the end of the spectrum, right? If it's a 10 out of 10, that you operate at a 10, I have yet to meet anybody whose life operates at a 10 out of 10, who has complete control over their schedule. And if you are one of those people, then please tell me exactly what it is that you're doing. And we can share that information with the rest of the world so that we don't have to struggle and suffer through the realities of the unpredictability. Now, I say that, and on the one hand, unpredictability is often a challenge, right? Because it does disrupt a schedule if you have one. But unpredictability is also a gift, because it is often those things that we cannot predict, that we cannot plan for, that are also really exciting, right? It's that opportunity to work on a case that you didn't see coming, that you're super excited about. It's the opportunity to go speak that you didn't know was about to show up in your inbox, and you're really excited about it, right? It's your child has been made the lead in the school musical, and there's a rehearsal tonight, and you're really excited to go to it. So there's going to be times when the unpredictable thing is really wonderful. So I don't want to label chaos or unpredictable events as something that is going to always be negative, right? It isn't. But what it will do is disrupt your schedule. So if you're looking at control and how do you actually get control, that is likely a goal or a desire or a dream, perhaps, that is highly unlikely to occur. Not only are other people potentially going to do things that affect your schedule. I talked about a few examples. Maybe somebody's late, maybe somebody doesn't show up. A client comes to you with an emergency situation and you need to clear all work from your day because you need to deal with that emergency, right? It truly is an emergency. And sometimes that comes from you, right? And, if you've ever struggled with motivation or procrastination or a feeling of overwhelm or a feeling of stuckness, or you're in a low mood or you're feeling anxious, we are humans, and human beings are not always the most efficient. We can set aside 9 a.m. to start the project and not feel like doing it at 9 a.m. And so you may find yourself turning to other things, answering emails, doing your timesheets, checking on someone down the hall, anything to distract you from doing a task that you don't feel like doing. And so not only do we need to contend with the outside world, but there's also the internal battle that we sometimes face when it comes to adhering to our schedule. And so planning is absolutely, yes, it's a way of setting up a schedule, right? And if that schedule gets disrupted, wonderful. If we have a plan, we are now moving things around on our plan. If you think about Tetris, it's a game where, if this is before your time, you're basically layering blocks in on top of each other. And so if you have a calendar already and there's a disruption to your calendar, that's great because you can take what was blocked for, say, Wednesday afternoon-ish, and you can move that to Friday, for example. You're playing Tetris. You're not starting from scratch with kind of a chaotic lack of knowledge of what's going on in the first place. And so we're just dropping it in and we don't really know how that's affecting our schedule. When you have your schedule planned, you can forecast, right? You can forecast the obstacles and you can also adapt to obstacles. Even in that world, though, right? Even in that world, there are going to be times where you simply cannot predict. And what ends up happening is that your schedule doesn't get adhered to and there's work that needs to be done. And this is something that comes up. And I really wish that I could say that there's an answer to this other than we need to make that time up somewhere else. And so this leads us to point number 3, which is having overflow capacity. An overflow capacity in my world and in the world of lawyers that I work with typically is evenings and weekends. And so what does that look like? And does it really have to be that way? I think it does. I'm really having that heart-to-heart with you. If you're considering your life and you're considering wanting to have a practice where you have this variety of work, you have all the kind of, there's a word I'm trying to think of, and the trappings, I suppose, of private practice, the variety of clients, the variety of work. You've got a schedule where you're pretty much in control. You have really interesting projects. Things aren't necessarily cookie cutter. And so things are going to happen, right? You're going to have speaking engagements, you're going to have trials, you're going to have closings, you're going to have periods in your practice that are really busy and practice times that are quieter. You're going to have emails. I've yet to meet a lawyer who doesn't struggle with the volume of emails coming in and being responsive. So if you're dealing with all those things, chances are you're not going to get everything done exactly in the time that you had allocated. And so this is where I think it's really important to be realistic about the fact that there will be likely times in your practice where you'll need to deal with overflow. And what I always recommend to lawyers that I work with, especially if they're struggling with this, is to be really intentional about when that overflow can happen. And I like to designate a day. Before I had kids, I would deal with overflow just as it came up. If I could, I would do something. I'd stay longer at the office. I would come in on a weekend day, and it wasn't really a big deal after having kids. And it's now been 13 years. So it's not like this happened yesterday. But after having kids, I realized I had to be so much more intentional about when that would happen, because during the work week, and this is true still today, I'm coaching but I still run a business. And so you can imagine I've got deadlines, I've got work schedules, I've got what is likely the equivalent of your billable hours. And so where does the overflow go? It goes into times that are not busy at work, right? If you're used to getting emails all day and the emails only stop at 5 p.m., then you might need to designate some work time that starts at 5 p.m. on a day of the week where you can make it reasonably predictable for yourself and for others, especially if you have others that you live with, a partner, a spouse, children, etc. You may need to arrange for childcare on the day that you have planned for overflow. But the beauty of having overflow is that you then know, right? Overflow designated time is that you now know where you're going to put the work that didn't get done during the day. So you want to figure out, what does that look like for you? How are you going to manage overflow work? Now, I say that, and in private practice, if it's still the same as it was when I was in private practice, and I think it is, there will be times when you're in a trial, for example, where every day is an overflow day. And so you're going to need to strategically plan for those periods so that you can keep your energy up, so that it is sustainable, so that everything that needs to be covered is covered. And that might mean having more help at home. It might be having extra coverage for your children. If you have children, it might mean a number of different things, having more support at work. So think about what that looks like for you, what overflow would be required. And then we want to pencil it in so that we know that we can use that time if we need it. I also love weekends for this, and I still use weekends. I try to do additional overflow work in the mornings, and sometimes it takes all day. And that's something that I've accepted because I also have weekdays where I have dinner with my family every night. And so the trade-off for me is that I need to be intentional about how I'm going to use my weekends. And it doesn't mean that every weekend is an overflow weekend, but if I have overflow and I know it's not going to happen between Monday and Friday, then I designate time on the weekend. And this is what I would encourage you to consider as well is, okay, if you're not going to get everything done between Monday and Friday, when would you ideally put that time on your schedule on a weekend so that you can deal with the overflow? And again, if you're one of those people who never has overflow and everything happens in the parameters of the time that you have predicted and planned for, please do tell me, because I would absolutely love to hear how you make it work. The closest that I've come to a solution is exactly what I've described, right? Let's be strategic about when we are going to deal with the things that don't get done. So that is number 3. So again, kind of going back to that big picture, you're in private practice, you're wondering, is this sustainable? We've chosen an environment that best suits you. You're being really intentional about planning. So you're doing everything that you can. In the nature of control, you're doing everything that you can. You've got that backup plan, right? The overflow capacity for when the chaos sets in, right? The unpredictable things happen. And so you didn't get the things done that you wanted to get done in the time frame that you'd allocated, but you still have time to get them done within a reasonable time frame. So we've got that built in. And that brings us to the 4th and final factor that I would love to discuss with you today, and that is the internal factor. And the internal factor is really looking at the way that you're thinking about your practice. And so you might consider this mindset, right? And there's a few different ways of thinking about this, right? If you imagine your mind, for example, as being on a spectrum where sometimes your brain feels like it's chaos and sometimes your brain feels like it's completely in control, right? We all have days like that, days where we're like, yeah, I've got this, I'm on top of it, and days where everything just seems like a jumbled mess. And you may have heard the expression that your external world is a reflection of your internal world. And in many cases, this is true. For some of you, you might find you need an absolutely pristine and organized workspace in order to feel calm. For those of you who, maybe like me, have a number of people living in your house, where the idea of having a decluttered and very seamless external world is very desirable, but very unrealistic, then maybe you train yourself to have the calm internally despite the external chaos. I don't know. That's going to look different for everybody. But we do want to have ways for you to do maintenance, right? If you imagine that your brain is a little bit like a physical space, and it is, but let's say a closet or a workspace or your laptop, that you look at that initial screen where you've got all your files organized, right? We want to think about your brain in that same way. How can we organize your thinking so that you feel internally a sense of calm, even if what is happening outside of you is a little bit chaotic, right? That there's less control than you'd like to have. This is internal work. And so it's a little bit different from the planning and the structuring and the scheduling and all that. It's how you're perceiving the world around you. And so what are some ways that you might be able to better manage the mindset, the internal perception that you have of your external surroundings? And I've got a few suggestions here. So number one is to structure your life or structure your thinking in such a way that you're able to have clarity in the way that you think. And by this, what I would recommend is having a way to systemize things so that you're not constantly having to reinvent the wheel. What does that mean exactly? Well, I gave an example at the very beginning about working memory and how when you try to hold everything in your memory, it can become very heavy. I love the expression, don't use your brain as a storage locker, because what effectively that means is that you're burning a very high level energy, right? Your executive functioning skills, if you're not familiar with what those are, the skills that you use to execute tasks. It includes working memory, or they include working memory, time management, task initiation, task sticking to the task, following through on the task, time estimate. There's a whole bunch of different skills that are comprised within your executive functions. And what's fascinating about that part of your brain, the executive thinking, is that it's a relatively small part of your brain's capacity, the things that it does. And so I've heard 5% as a number. So you might imagine your executive skills are about 5% of your mental capacity. The rest is kind of happening in the background. Your brain loves to be efficient, so it's going to default as much as possible. And so when you're doing something that requires that conscious thinking, that executive thinking, it's a relatively small part of your brain's capacity and it's fragile, right? Relatively speaking, you burn through that capacity. So decision-making is an example where the more decisions that you make in a day, the more you're burning up that capacity, the more you're trying to hold on to in your memory, you're burning through that capacity. And so what we want to do is preserve as much of that capacity as possible. So a few ways that you can do that is to create habits, right? If you've got habits that are wired, they become hardwired over the course of time, you now no longer have to think about it, right? This is why when you go to brush your teeth, it's not requiring a lot of mental energy because you've done it so many times. It's a habit, right? When I load the dishwasher, for example, it's a habit because I have a system that I use and I follow it every single time. And the cups and the plates and the cutlery, they all have designated places in my mind. It saves me from having to rethink every single time where things go. So you want to have habits like your typical work days where you're work from home versus work inside of the office, or maybe you can compartmentalize the tasks that you do. A typical day will start with answering emails, or it starts with your heavy drafting. And then we have emails right before lunch. And then the afternoon is meeting times. And before every day wraps up, you have a 30-minute window to close up your day and plan for the next day or something like that. What we're talking about here is just creating habits and systems and routines. The more of those you have, the less you're having to make new decisions, fresh decisions in a day. And so that's going to lighten the load on your executive skills. Process. That's a similar thing, right? If there's certain standard procedures that you do at work, you might think about how you can develop a process for each of them so that you're no longer having to rethink. If you want to ask somebody else to do it, you can give them that process. And so you're streamlining things in a way that you now no longer have to make a decision, fresh decisions, rethink it, rebuild the wheel or whatever it is each time that you do it. You might think of frameworks. So when I work with clients and we're talking about your legal practice, for example, I like to talk about frameworks. So the framework of imagining your practice from the perspective of your substantive work being one pillar, your clients and relationships as being one pillar, and the way that you manage your time as being one pillar. So we've now simplified your practice into a framework that is made up of 3 different things. It facilitates the thinking around it. And so you might have areas in your life, in your practice, where by creating a framework, you simplify the process, you take the pressure off your brain, you make it more clear, it feels less chaotic because now we've got some categories. And then finally, what I'd suggest here is mindfulness. And mindfulness to me isn't necessarily sitting around chanting Kumbaya. It's nothing like that. Mindfulness is actually one of the most effective tools that you can use to understand what is happening between your ears and what is happening emotionally and how all of that is affecting the way that you act in the world. So there is a correlation between the way that you think, feel, and act. And to me, mindfulness is having a way of identifying what it is that you are thinking. If you are sitting down to do your timesheets and you find yourself procrastinating, what's going on there? The thinking is probably, I don't want to do these timesheets. The thinking might be, I don't have enough time to record, or I have too much time to record. This is tedious. This is boring. I don't want to do this. This is not urgent. I don't have to submit my time for another week or whatever it happens to be. So there's a thought there, this internal message that you're delivering to yourself. The thought is creating a feeling, right? The feeling might be something like boredom or dread or anxiety or fear or apathy or avoidance. And so the thoughts and the feelings are correlated and they lead to you taking an action or not taking an action, right? It might mean that instead of doing the time, entering your time, posting your time, whatever that looks like for you, you push the task away, you open a different window in your computer, you pick up your phone and start to scroll, you stand up and go grab a cup of coffee. So you can see how the way that you think, feel, and act are all related, right? And it's not unilateral in terms of direction. They influence each other in different ways, right? This is sometimes how you might find yourself making a rash decision, right? If you get really upset over something, right? Somebody cuts you off in traffic and you yell at them. It's that feeling of anger that motivates the action. Is that how you want to respond, react? Maybe not. But once you start developing a habit of mindfulness, being able to break down how you're thinking, feeling, and acting, again, you start to have a lot more leverage over how you feel in your practice. So if you notice yourself feeling stressed, or if you feel out of control, or you feel like there's a lot of chaos, we can start to look at what is going on beneath the surface and create new ways of looking at things, right? Create different strategies to overcome those difficult emotions. And that will then in turn create a sense of calm, right? Create a feeling of control, even in those situations where otherwise there may be a lot of chaos. So that really is our final factor. So again, going back to that big picture, right? You joined me here today because you wanted me to help you. You wanted some guidance on what to do, right? In this world of the private practice where you've got chaos on one end of the spectrum, you've got control on the other end of the spectrum, and you are somewhere in the middle, right? And every day is going to be different. Some days you might be a 4, some days you might be a 9. And what I'm offering to you today are 4 different frames. We talked about your container, where you situate yourself in terms of workplace. We talked about planning and scheduling and using time management strategies to set yourself up for success. We talked about the realistic need or the reality of overflow and where that's going to go, how we're going to deal with things that are outside of what we plan for. And we talked about mindset, right? We talked about having a way of having an internal management system, like a brain management system, so that regardless of what's happening outside of you, you've got tools to create calm where there may be chaos. And when you do all of these things, right, and you start to implement, then you'll have a better sense. Is practice, private practice, the way that you're practicing, is it sustainable for you? Can you make it sustainable? And if you're doing these things, then you might find that the answer is yes. And if you're doing these things and you find that the answer is no, then maybe we've got a different conversation to be having. But what I'm inviting you to reflect on, what I'm encouraging you to develop for yourself are practices. And this has been a podcast episode. I'm just looking at the time. It's about 45 minutes that you've invested. So thank you for joining me. It's hopefully one of those 45 minutes that will pay dividends in your practice. And it's a signal that there is so much potential here. There's so much potential into ways of managing, because this is just scratching the surface. Really, it's 45 minutes. And if there are things you would like to explore more deeply, number one, I encourage you to go to my podcast. If you're interested in hearing more episodes, I mentioned there's a podcast roadmap. There will be a link to that with the notes. You're welcome to check that out. You can Google the title or search titles of these podcast episodes for time management related episodes. You'll find them. There's a number of them. You're welcome to do that. And of course, you're welcome to reach out to me personally. And I would absolutely love to support you. I'd love to help you design systems that are customized to you. And that can be through one-to-one coaching, if that's something that you're interested in, so we can talk about what that would look like. It could also be through presenting and speaking and teaching and training. So if you're thinking about your associates or your lawyers at your firm and you'd love some support in terms of how to help them with time management, I can come in, I can present, I can help you understand what tools are available to you. And also what I love about teaching in a context like that is being able to create discussion in a room so that you are able with your team to discuss what's working, to discuss strategies that you're using. So maybe there will be somebody in the room who has cracked the code of how to get it all done within a 9 to 5 window. And again, if that's you, reach out to me. I want to hear from you. And if not, well, at least we all have ways of dealing with different challenges that come our way, because everybody is wired differently. Everybody's practice looks different. Everybody's culture within a firm, within a department is all different. And so the idea of a one size fits all is unrealistic. So I don't propose that as a solution, but what I do propose is a customized solution that's going to leverage your strengths, that's going to align with your values, that's going to allow you to feel on that spectrum from 0 to 10, from absolute chaos to total control, that you are in a zone that you're comfortable with, that is desirable for you, and that makes your practice sustainable. So thank you so much for joining me here this week. I hope you have enjoyed today's episode. I've loved sharing it with you, and any questions, feedback you have for me, I would love to hear it. Thank you so much, and I look forward to reconnecting again with you next week. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.